A bronze face came up out of the dark, wet soil, taller than a man's head, with eyes that pushed out of the skull like two cylinders. There is nothing else on earth quite like it. Below it lay another, and the edge of a third, a whole pit of faces staring up at the light, and every one of them broken. This was 1986, at a brickyard outside Guanghon in the Sichuan basin of southwest China. Two men had been digging clay for bricks. They were not looking for anything. What they found was a place we now call Sanxingdui, a city of Bronze Age China, more than 3,000 years old. Whoever made these faces could pour molten metal into the shape of a god, and then those same people had broken every one, snapped them, burned them in fire, and laid them down in the earth, carefully, side by side, before they covered them over. So here is what the pit asks, and has kept asking ever since. Who were they? And why would a people destroy their own gods with their own hands and bury what they had made? The digging stopped being about bricks. Word went out, and within hours archaeologists were on their knees at the edge of the pit, lifting out what the clay had been hiding for 30 centuries. By the time they finished, the first two pits had given up more than 1,000 objects, and almost every one of them carried the same wound: broken, burned, snapped or crushed or warped by heat. The faces came up first, bronze masks and bronze heads, one after another, a whole rank of them, each one flat and severe, a sharp nose, a thin, pressed mouth, ears that flare out to the sides. They are not soft faces, they are made to be looked up at. Some still had worn gold foil pressed over the bronze, so a few of these faces had once been gilded, gold over metal, shining in whatever lamplight they were meant for. And then, lower down, the soil gave up a man, a bronze man, standing on a tall pedestal. The figure himself stands about as high as a real person, his feet bare on the platform, his body wrapped in robes covered in fine cast patterns. His arms are raised in front of him, and his hands are curled into two great rings, hands far too large for the body, as if he were gripping something thick and important. But the rings are empty. Whatever he was holding is gone, if it was ever there at all. A king, or a priest, or a god, with his hands closed around nothing. Remember those empty hands. They turn out to matter more than almost anything else in the pit. There was gold in there too, and not just the foil on the faces. A mask of gold, beaten thin, a human face in pure, precious metal, though only about half of it survived. And cowrie shells, small ocean shells in the hundreds, in this city in the mountains. And then, the strangest thing of all, pieces of a tree, cast in bronze, branch by branch, and when the fragments were painstakingly fitted back together, it stood almost 4 meters tall, taller than the room most people will watch this in. 9 birds perched at the tips of its branches. A dragon ran down the trunk, head first toward the ground. The very top was missing, so it had once been taller still. A tree of the whole universe, poured in metal, and then taken apart. A 4-meter bronze tree is not a thing a small or simple people make. To cast bronze at this scale, you need furnaces, you need alloy in quantity, you need moulds and a workshop, and craftsmen who have done it 100 times before. It is the work of a state, a treasury, a religion with deep pockets and centuries of practice. These were people who could build a 4-meter bronze tree, and they had broken it into pieces and put it in the ground. It helps to know where we are standing and when. The Chengdu Plain is a wide bowl of farmland in Sichuan, ringed by mountains, watered by rivers running down off the Tibetan highlands. Around 1600 BCE, a city rose here. Not a village, a city, with walls of rammed earth, packed down layer upon layer until they stood 8 to 10 meters high. Walls so thick at the base that you could have driven carts along the top of them, enclosing something like 3.5 square kilometers. That is a serious city for its age, anywhere in the ancient world. People lived behind those walls for centuries. They cast bronze, carved jade, traded for ivory, and built temples for the gods whose faces came out of that brickyard. This was happening at the same time as the Shang dynasty, far to the northeast in the Yellow River Valley. The Shang are the China most people have heard of, the dynasty of the oracle bones and the great bronze cauldrons, the China that gets into the textbooks. The two worlds were roughly 800 kilometers apart, separated by mountains and gorges, and a world apart in almost every other way, too. The Shang wrote. They carved questions to their ancestors onto bone and shell and kept what amount to records. They made bronze, but their bronze is mostly vessels, cups and cauldrons for wine and food and offerings. Sanxingdui made faces, trees, bodies, a whole imagination the Shang never touched. Later Chinese writers had a name for this kingdom. They called it Shu, and there is one line written down more than 1,000 years after the city was already gone that is hard to read and then forget. A chronicle from the 4th century of our era remembers the first king of Shu, a ruler named Chang, and says he had protruding eyes. Protruding eyes, like the faces in the pit. It is tempting, and it should be resisted, at least as proof. That chronicle was set down 1,500 years after Sanxingdui was abandoned. It is a folk memory, an echo, not a record. Which points at the deepest fact about this place, the one everything else has to be built around. They left no writing we can read. A handful of scratched marks have turned up on a few objects, but they are too few and too simple to be a script. They look like ownership marks or decoration, not a system that records speech. So this is not an undeciphered language waiting for someone clever to crack it. As far as we can tell, there may be no language here to find at all. That silence costs us almost everything. We have no name they called themselves, no words in their own mouths, no god's name, no king's name, no list of their rulers, no account of what they were doing in those temples or why. The Shang left us their questions to the dead, carved into bone. Sanxingdui left us silence. We have everything they built and not one sentence they wrote. Every single thing anyone says about what their gods meant or what they believed is read off the shapes of the objects by people who cannot hear them speak. The faces had actually been waiting a long time to be understood. Back in the late 1920s, a farmer of the Yan family was digging an irrigation ditch near here when he turned up a cache of jade blades in the mud. Careful scholarship dates that to 1927. The popular retellings say 1929. That small disagreement, 2 years that nobody can quite pin down, is worth holding on to because it is the first hint of how careful this whole story has to be. The cleanest facts about Sanxingdui come with footnotes. The jades passed through collectors' hands, and the trail went cold for a generation. Then came the brickyard in 1986, and the pits full of broken gods. And then the site went quiet again for more than 30 years, until 2019. Beside the first 2 pits, working the ground with new tools, archaeologists found 6 more. This time they did it carefully, slowly, under climate-controlled shelters in protective suits, lifting each fragment with the patience the find deserved. Between 2019 and 2022, those new pits gave up more than 17,000 objects. Bronze, gold, jade, ivory, and a few things nobody expected, including faint traces of silk and a wooden box once painted with cinnabar red. The dig that had stopped for a generation became one of the largest archaeological projects in the world. Of those 17,000 objects, only some 4,000 to 5,000 came out roughly whole. The rest were fragments, a vast jigsaw of deliberately broken things waiting to be put back together. And every new piece sharpened the 2 questions the pit had been asking since the first face came up out of the soil. Who were these people, and why did they destroy their own gods? The rest of this is the work of answering them. And the place to start is the first question, because the honest answer to it kills 2 things almost everyone believes walking in. 2 false mysteries that have grown up around this place like weeds. Pull them out, and the second question, the why, is left standing alone in the open, and it turns out to be far stranger than the stories we tell about strangers from the sky. So we begin where the evidence is hardest to argue with the metal. A scientist takes a fleck of a Sanxingdui bronze, no bigger than a crumb, and dissolves it. Inside the metal is lead, and lead carries a kind of signature. Different ores from different parts of the world leave behind different ratios of lead isotopes, like a fingerprint left in the alloy by the rock it came from. The lead in Sanxingdui's bronzes turned out to carry a rare and distinctive fingerprint, a particular, unusual signature that does not show up in most metal of the period. And the same rare fingerprint sits in the royal bronzes of the Shang kings at their capital 1,200 kilometers to the northeast. The 2 civilizations were drinking from the same well of metal. That is not interpretation. That is not a scholar's reading of a symbol, the kind of thing 2 experts can argue about for 30 years. That is chemistry. And chemistry is the same in any laboratory on Earth. The people of Sanxingdui, the people whose gods look like nothing else ever made, were drawing their bronze from the same supply network as the most famous dynasty in early China. There is a careful caveat to keep. Exactly where that ore was originally mined is still argued over, and you will hear confident claims that the metal came from far away that go well past the evidence. The honest fact is narrower and harder to dodge. Whatever the well was, Sanxingdui and the Shang kings were drinking from it together. And the lead is only the first line of the proof. Look at their jade. The ritual blades and discs and tubes they buried are near twins of forms made centuries earlier across China, shapes whose family tree runs back through the older heartlands all the way to the far eastern coast. These are not local inventions. They are part of a ritual vocabulary shared across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. Then look at the bronze itself more closely. When scientists studied the leftover casting cores, the clay centers used to shape the hollow bronzes, they found something telling. The strange stuff, the masks and the heads and the tree, was very likely cast right here, locally, by Sanxingdui's own workshops. But the ordinary wine vessels, the familiar Chinese shapes, point outward, toward the bronze traditions of the Yangtze River to the east. So the picture is precise. They cast their own gods in their own utterly distinctive style, and they borrowed the standard Chinese vessels, the ones that could sit on a Shang shelf and have no one blink, from their neighbours. Their own genius for the sacred, the common canon for the ordinary. And then there are the shells. Nearly 5,000 cowrie shells came out of this site, small tropical seashells from the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. One bronze vessel alone held more than 900 of them, packed inside like coins in a jar. This is a city 600 miles from the nearest coast, in a landlocked mountain basin, and someone had carried thousands of ocean shells all the way here, hand to hand, over mountains, along trade roads that ran southwest toward Burma and India, roads older than the famous Silk Road by centuries. The same roads brought the ivory and the gold and the rare materials that this plain does not produce on its own. Sanxingdui was not the end of the world. It was a node on a network, a city plugged into a Bronze Age exchange that reached across half a continent. The shells were not money here. They read as sacred wealth, offerings, treasure piled up for the gods and then buried with them. So put it together. The metal, the jade, the wine vessels, the ocean shells. Every line says the same thing. These were not strangers from nowhere. They were inside the Bronze Age Chinese world, trading along its roads, casting with its metal, borrowing its forms. They spoke the common tongue of Bronze Age China. They just said something with it that no one else, anywhere, ever said. And that makes the broken faces stranger, not less strange. If these had been isolated aliens, cut off from everyone, the weirdness would explain itself. People in a sealed-off valley make strange things, of course they do. But that is not what happened. They were connected, sophisticated, casting with the same metal as the Shang kings, carving the same jade forms as the rest of China, trading for ocean shells from 1,000 miles away. And in the middle of all that contact, surrounded by neighbours making cups and cauldrons, they made gods with cylinder eyes and 4-meter trees, and a hall of figures standing in the dark. Art with almost no parallel in the ancient world, made by people who could have copied their neighbours and chose not to. So the question the broken faces really ask is not the one everyone assumes. It is not, who were these mysterious strangers from nowhere? They were not strangers, and they were not from nowhere. The question is the opposite, and it is harder. Why did these neighbours, these connected, ordinary enough people of the Bronze Age world, make something so utterly unlike anyone else, and then gather it all up and smash it? That sends us back to the pits with new eyes. Here is the picture almost everyone carries. The people of Shu gathering their treasures at the edge of a pit and setting them on fire. A great blaze, gods burning in the ground, the bronzes melting where they lay. It is a vivid image, and it is in nearly every retelling. It did not happen. When archaeologists reached the bottom of the pits and studied the floors and the walls, they found something that quietly demolishes that picture. The floors are not scorched. The walls show no heat damage. There was real fire involved. You can see it in the objects. Bronze warped and twisted, some pieces actually melted down into solid lumps of metal. That takes great heat, 600 degrees, 800, more. A fire like that, burning in the pit, would have baked the clay walls hard, turned them a different colour, left an unmistakable scar in the ground. The clay is unbaked, the walls are clean. The fire had happened somewhere else. What that means is a two-stage ceremony, careful and deliberate, in a particular order. First, the offerings were burned on a great fire outside, perhaps on the open river terrace nearby. The bronzes were heated until some of them deformed and a few melted. And then, while the ash was still hot, the broken and scorched gods were gathered up and carried over and laid down in the pits. Burn outside, bury inside. This is not improvised. It is a known kind of ritual with deep roots, a way of decommissioning the sacred by fire and then committing it to the earth. The way you might respectfully retire something holy rather than simply throw it away. And to be fair to the evidence, this finding holds for the pits studied so far, the ones that have actually been taken apart and read, layer by layer. Not every pit has been read this closely, but the ones that have all tell the same story. There is a small detail that proves how controlled this was. Among the offerings were elephant tusks, ivory, and much of it is blackened. But the ivory was not burned by flame. It was carbonized by the residual heat of the hot ash it was buried in, a slow scorching at around 400 degrees, the kind you get from being packed in something smouldering rather than thrown on a fire. This was not a panic. Nobody flees a disaster and then layers hot ash around their ivory just so. Because that is the other thing the pits show. The fill is ordered. Walk it from the bottom up, the way the archaeologists came down through it. The bronze and the jade and the gold went in first at the bottom, the heavy sacred metal. Then the elephant tusks, dozens of them, whole tusks, laid across the top like a final blanket, sealing the offering. 7 of the 8 pits had that layer of burnt tusks, then ash, then clay, pounded down hard. Layer by layer, in sequence, the same way in pit after pit. And there was silk in there, woven into the ritual. The traces of it survived only because metal ions from the bronze had soaked into the fabric and mineralized it, which almost never happens, because silk normally rots away to nothing. The reading is that the silk was a kind of medium, a material thought to carry messages between the human world and the heavens. Even the cloth was part of the talking to gods. None of this is the behavior of frightened people. You do not, in the middle of a catastrophe, sort your treasures by weight and material, burn them in the proper sequence, and tuck your ivory in on top. There is a word for what this looks like, and it is the opposite of panic. It looks like a funeral. The pits were not filled in a hurry. And then the single most decisive piece of evidence, the one that turns a strong suspicion into something close to proof. As the archaeologists worked through the new pits, they kept finding broken fragments that did not fit anything in their own pit. And then, carefully, with thousands of pieces spread across tables, they began matching those orphan fragments to fragments lying in a completely different pit, meters away. One bronze object, smashed and scattered, its pieces salted across 3 separate pits, and then reassembled by hand into a single whole. And it was not just one object. Matching fragments span 6 of the pits. Consider what that requires. You cannot break a single bronze and scatter its pieces across 6 different holes in the ground, unless all 6 holes are open and being filled at the same time, by the same people, in one coordinated event. Not pit 1 this decade and pit 5 the next, all of them, together, one ceremony. The scattered fragments are like a torn letter, ripped apart and dropped in 6 different drawers, that fits back together only if one hand tore it. So they put a date on the whole thing. More than 100 samples run through radiocarbon dating, and the answer announced at a forum in 2025 was tight. The burial happened somewhere between roughly 1200 and 1010 BCE, late in the Shang period. One coordinated event, late Shang. Hold that window in mind, because it is going to matter later, and not in the way you would expect. One more thing, before we ask why. This kind of ceremony, burning the sacred and then burying it, was not unique to Shu. The practice of burning an offering and then committing it to the earth runs back 1,000 years in China, deep into the cultures of the Central Plains, long before Sanxingdui existed. Burning, burying, sinking offerings into the ground, these were part of the broad religious repertoire of Bronze Age China. So the people of Sanxingdui were not doing something inexplicable, something no one had ever seen. They were using a shared ritual grammar, the common religious language of their whole world, in their own particular dialect. That is the move that matters here. It takes the destruction from inexplicable to legible. Not unsolved because it is alien, but a recognizable kind of human religious act, performed by a specific people for a reason that is theirs alone. Which is what makes the next question so hard. We know the how. We know it was deliberate, reverent, organized, one event, in a form their whole world would have recognized. What we do not know is the one thing that would make sense of it. Why? This is where the hard evidence runs out, and we have to weigh motive instead. There is no confession here, no tablet that says we did this because. And one thing has to be said before we start, because it shapes everything. The way the objects were buried, broken but ordered, burned but laid down with care, tells us the people still revered them. This was not vandalism. Whoever did this was not destroying their enemies' gods in contempt. As one archaeologist put it, the deliberate, careful manner of the burial means the people who made these pits must still have honoured the things they were burying. So whatever the reason was, it was not hatred, it was something stranger. They broke what they loved. So the honest thing is to lay out the real possibilities, live with each one for a moment as if it were true, and then check it against what the ground actually shows. 4 of them are worth your time. The first is a religious reform. Suppose the old gods simply stopped working. Suppose the rains failed, or a war was lost, or a king died young and unlucky, and the priests came to believe that the bronze deities they had served for generations were spent, used up, no longer answering prayers. There is a documented practice in ancient China of doing exactly this, of retiring gods that had failed and making new ones to replace them. You do not throw an old god in the rubbish, you decommission it properly. Burn the old images, bury them with respect, start clean. It fits the care in the pits beautifully. The trouble is that nothing at the site itself records it. It is an idea borrowed from the wider Chinese world and laid gently over the silence here. Legible, but unproven. The second is a disaster. Suppose the earth itself moved. Sichuan sits on one of the most dangerous fault lines in China, the same fault that ruptured in the catastrophic earthquake of 2008, and there is evidence in the old ground layers of a powerful quake in this area back in the Bronze Age. Suppose the people, shaken, their world cracked open, gathered their sacred things and buried them to keep them safe, or to appease whatever had grown angry. One excavator made a sharp point in favor of something like this. The bronzes were so valuable, he said, that people must have had a truly compelling reason to break them all and carry none of them to safety. A disaster is one kind of compelling reason. But the burial does not look like fear. It looks organized, layered, unhurried, more funeral than flight. And the moment the city was finally abandoned may not be the same moment the pits were filled. They could be 2 separate events, years apart. The science here is honest and narrow. It says a great earthquake may have played a part. It does not say a flood destroyed Sanxingdui, and neither should anyone else. The third is the best supported, and it is the darkest. Suppose there were 2 powers inside this city all along, a priesthood who owned the gods and the bronze and the right to speak to heaven, and a line of secular rulers, kings and warlords who wanted that wealth and that authority for themselves. Look closely at the figures they cast, and you can almost see the 2 groups. 2 different ways of wearing the hair, the priests one way, the nobles another. 2 kinds of men in metal. And suppose the rulers won. A coup. They overthrew the priests, seized the enormous treasury of sacred bronze, broke the gods that had given the old religious order its power, burned them and buried them, ending the old regime by ending its gods. The city's final phase does show signs of trouble, broken walls, water systems altered, building work that simply stops. It is the reading that explains the most pieces of evidence at once. But it is still a reading. The 2 groups in the figures are an interpretation of hairstyles in bronze. Who actually won, and whether there was a coup at all, is written nowhere. So we hold it as the leading interpretation, not as what happened. And the fourth, the Great War. Around 1046 BCE, the Shang dynasty fell, toppled by the rising Zhou in one of the most famous regime changes in all of Chinese history. And the kingdom of Shu was among the Western powers caught up in that upheaval, possibly with different factions backing different sides. Suppose the people of Shangshui, with armies on the move and the old order collapsing, buried everything sacred to keep it out of enemy hands. It is the most cinematic story of the 4. And here is the trouble with it. Remember that radiocarbon window, the one to hold in mind. The burial mostly happened before that war, a generation or more before it. The most famous explanation, the one that feels the most like history with a capital H, is the one the dates fight hardest. 4 suspects, a reform we cannot find at the site, a disaster the burial does not look like, a coup that explains the most and proves the least, a war that came too late. None of them confessed. But one of them, the coup, points somewhere. It points away from this ruined city, down the road to where the survivors might have gone. Before we follow them down that road, one thing has to be settled, and it pays off fast. The bronze man on his pedestal, the one from the very first pit, with his great ring hands closed around nothing. We never answered what he was holding, and his empty hands turn out to be the door into the whole religion. Start with the eyes, the thing everyone remembers, the cylinders pushing out of the face. The easy move is to call them not human. But read as religion, they make a different kind of sense. These were not portraits of people. The leading reading is that they are gods, or the tools of a priesthood talking to gods. And the huge eyes are about divine sight, a power to see across distance and across worlds that ordinary people did not have. The giant eyes were not made for you to look at. They were made to look at you. Stand before a wall of these faces in the lamplight, and the worshipper is the one being watched. That is a human religion's idea of how a god holds you. The strangeness is in the form. The feeling underneath it is one we would recognize. Then the hall of heads, the rank of severe faces everyone pictures as an army. It never was. Each one has small tabs at the neck, and the reading is that every head was once fixed to a full-size body of wood that rotted away over the centuries while the bronze survived. The temple was not lined with heads on a shelf, it was filled with full-size figures, a standing crowd of them, with smaller attendants kneeling among them, arms held out to carry an offering or wait for an answer. They were not masks for faces, they were faces for a building. And one object is almost 2 on the nose. In one pit lay the broken pieces of a bronze tableau, a kind of altar in tiers, a platform, a ring of human figures, mythical beasts above. The excavators read it as a model of the ceremony itself, the whole act of worship cast as a single object. They built a model of their own ritual in metal, and then, like everything else, they smashed it and buried it. Even the picture of the ceremony went into the ground. And the great tree pulls it together, 4 meters of bronze, 9 birds at its tips, a dragon climbing down the trunk. The reading is that it is the axis of the universe, the trunk joining the underworld at its roots to the sky at its crown, the birds carrying the sun across the heavens. One scholar tells it through the old myth that there were once 10 suns, and the birds carried 9 of them away, so people would only ever see one at a time. Eye, sun, bird, tree, one system, a single religion built around sight and the heavens, and a way of climbing between earth and sky. Which brings us back to his empty hands. The king shaman on his pedestal, the highest figure they made, his ring hands curled around a gap. Scholars guess he once gripped something, a lost staff, maybe an elephant tusk like the ones in the pits. But it is a guess. The proof is gone, and the 2 hands do not even line up cleanly with each other, as if they held 2 different things. Or nothing. A king who left a statue and no name, and the statue is holding nothing. So here is the honest seam, and it runs under everything in this section. Every reading I have just given you, the gods, the divine sight, the wooden bodies, the tree of the universe, is iconography. It is the careful interpretation of images by people who cannot read a single word these makers wrote, because there is not a single word to read. The meanings are reconstructed by looking at the shapes and by borrowing from Chinese texts written more than 1,000 years later. As one curator put it, religion without writing is always a puzzle. This is the best guess anyone has. And this, right here, is the exact sentence where the guessing starts. We can read their universe better than we can read their reason. We have a map of their sky and a blank where their motive should be. To find the people themselves, where they came from we already know, we have to follow where they went, and that means leaving the pits for good. Everyone says Sanxingdui vanished, that a civilization rose, made impossible art, and then disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing but a hole full of broken gods. It is the line the whole mystery seems to rest on, and it is the line that is wrong. The city failed, the civilization did not. 40 kilometers from the ruined walls, near what is now the modern city of Chengdu, there is a second site, a place we call Jinsha. And when the city of Sanxingdui was abandoned, the gods moved there. The same religion, the same kind of people in the leading reading, and it carried on at the new place for roughly another 500 years. You can read the continuity straight off the objects. At Jinsha, there is a gold mask that closely matches the broken gold mask from Sanxingdui. The same idea, the same face in beaten gold. There are the same caches of elephant ivory, around a ton of whole tusks buried at the new site. The same kneeling figures, the same bronze birds. And there is one object that ties it all together. A thin disc of gold, only 12.5 centimeters across and almost weightless, with 4 birds flying in a ring around a central sun. 4 birds, 1 sun. The exact same theology as the 4-meter bronze tree, the same sun and the same birds, carried to the new city and worshipped for centuries more. Whatever died in those pits, this did not die, but it moved, changed. At the new city, the gods are not quite the same. The giant, terrifying masks shrink and soften into smaller, gentler ritual objects, things you could almost imagine being worn or carried rather than looming out of a temple wall. And the new city had no defensive walls at all, no great rammed earth ramparts like the old one. Something about how these people held power and feared their neighbors had changed in the move. A religion can survive a regime and still come out the other side wearing a different face. And here is where the destruction and the move tie together in one stroke. At the new city, the artisans kept making certain figures and stopped making others. They kept casting the secular nobles, the rulers, the men with the braided, flat-topped look. And they stopped casting the priests, the figures with the pinned hair who had owned the old religion. They kept making the kings, they stopped making the priests. That is the coup, written in bronze, 40 kilometers down the road. The smashed pits and the new city read as one event. The secular rulers overthrew the priesthood, broke the gods that had given the priests their power, and carried what was left to a fresh place with no old temple order owning them. There is even a hint of the seam in the ground. 2 of the pits at Sanxingdui itself look a little different from the others, a little more like the deposits at the new city, as if they sit right on the hinge between the old world and the next one. It is the strongest thread we have, and it is still a thread. We hold it as the leading interpretation, never as proof, because the link is read off the figures, not written down. And it carries a real limit. We know the religion moved. How much of the actual population moved with it, whether these were the same families or new ones inheriting old gods, we cannot yet say. No genetic link has been found tying the people of one site to the other. The gods relocated. The degree to which the people did is still open. There is one more thing the contact evidence forces, and it has to be handled with care. If Sanxingdui was inside the Bronze Age Chinese world, sharing metal and jade and trade, but making art like nothing else, then it was never a colony of the North, and it was never simply a branch of one parent tree. It is the clearest single piece of evidence that early China did not come from one source, that the civilization grew from many regions at once, several centers, each with its own character, in contact with one another. One archaeologist put the old blindness plainly. Sichuan, he said, was left out of the grand story of where Chinese history came from. All of it is in the open. The findings are published in international journals. The objects sit in a large public museum that anyone can walk into. The dating was announced from a stage at an open forum. The slow, careful pace of the digging is how serious archaeology is done now, so that nothing is lost to haste. The idea that early China had many sources rather than one is not a foreign accusation. It is mainstream scholarship, argued by Chinese and Western archaeologists alike for decades. The live edge of the debate is only about degree. How much was borrowed and how much invented here? And that is a genuine, ongoing question. The honest position is the calm one, and it sits between two louder stories. On one side, the fantasy of aliens and lost super-civilizations. On the other, the temptation to fold Sanxingdui neatly into a single triumphant national origin story. The evidence supports neither extreme. What it supports is messier and more interesting. Many sources, in real contact with one another, and one of them this strange, brilliant kingdom in the West, hiding in plain sight in a basin that the grand story had simply overlooked. There is a postscript to all of this, and it is the kind of thing that makes the hair stand up a little. That disc of gold from Jinsha, the 4 birds circling the sun, is the official emblem of the city of Chengdu today. A city of millions of people, with that 3,000-year-old symbol on its letterhead, on its signs, on the airport, woven through a busy modern place that mostly does not know whose gods it is wearing. The symbol is protected, too valuable to ever leave the country. The civilization that supposedly vanished without a trace is on the city's stationery. It never left. It is looked at, in passing, every single day, by people who do not know its name. That is the shape of the whole thing, if you stand back from it. 2 false mysteries cleared away, and the real one left standing in the middle, sharper than before. They did not come from nowhere. We can prove that in a laboratory. They did not disappear. We can see where they went and what they kept. Strip those 2 stories away, the alien and the vanished, and you do not lose the mystery. You finally get to see it clearly. So here is what we have at the end. We have everything they built, the faces with cylinder eyes, the bronze man holding nothing, the 4-meter tree, the hall of figures standing in the dark. We can trace where they came from because the metal in their bronzes tells us, in a language that does not lie. We can trace where they went because their gods are still being carved 40 kilometers down the road and worn by a city today. And we still do not know their name. We do not know their language, and we do not know why, on one ordered, careful night, a people who were neighbors of the most famous dynasty in early China, a people who could pour the universe into bronze, gathered up everything sacred they had ever made, burned it, broke it, and laid it in the ground. The alien story was always the boring story. It answered the question by pointing at the sky and walking away. The truth is harder, and it keeps every bit of the strangeness. The art really is like almost nothing else. The destruction really was deliberate. The difference is that now the people are real, traceable, our kind of people, with our kind of gods, and a reason that died with them. The mystery did not go away when we got honest about it. It just moved, from the sky to the human heart.